Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome back. We're in episode 24, season 4 of CarmelCast, and we're joined again, Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified. You're back with us again today.
Yes.
And again, Father Michael Joseph of St. Therese. I'm Deacon Brother Pier Giorgio of Christ the King. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, please visit our website at www.icspublications.org. So we've been beginning these episodes with a saying of light and love from the writings of Holy Father St. John of the Cross. It's my turn to pick one. So I picked saying number 97. The soul that walks in love neither tires others nor grows tired. And I think, in light of everything that we're called to do by our constitutions and by the various many ministries that we have and the things that God calls us and the order calls us to do and the church calls us to do, to think, it may seem so burdensome and tiresome at times, but to remember always that, things done with great love just provide the energy and provide the ability to do these things. And I know that I tire you guys very little.
How do you know?
So I must walk in great love because my ability to not tire my brethren. Anyway, in this episode, we're going to a very beautiful point in the life of St. John the Cross, in which he enters alongside Fray Antonio with our Holy Mother St. Teresa into the Discalced Reform. And the beginning of the Foundation of the Friars, the first Foundation of the Friars, a little over 450 years ago at Derawello. And maybe to just sort of give an idea of where Derawello lies in Spain, can one of you point that out to us in an imaginary map?
It's outside of, not too far from Avila. Well, it would have been within walking distance, I think, of Avila, and which is kind of northwest of Madrid, I guess. I think that's probably the best way to describe.
Good. So maybe we can talk first about this foundation of Derawello, how it gets started. It was a location chosen by St. Teresa for the friars.
Well, and it kind of came, sort of like most things, it kind of fell into her lap. Like she was looking for something, and then someone happened to mention there was this kind of farmstead that he had or knew about that he was willing to give, and so that she saw that as the hand of providence. This is where we'll start then. But she didn't have anything to begin with. She said she just weighed down with these permissions, but no, nothing really to start with.
She just had a friar and a half.
Yeah.
So explain that.
Well, I guess it was after the meeting with Teresa and John that she went back. She was like rejoicing with her community at meeting John of the Cross, and she said that now she has a friar and a half. And it's always speculated, like, who's the half friar? Is it John because he was known for being short in stature, or was it poor Fray Anthony, who she was not as thrilled about as she was with John of the Cross?
Yeah.
One of them was the half friar. But knowing Teresa's wit, I think she meant both of those meanings.
Yeah.
So
Half-witted.
yes. Yeah, but so John's away, he's finishing his studies because he has another year of studies, and so in that time, this is when Teresa's really laying the groundwork. And so it's interesting that she herself is the one who goes off to visit, because she receives word about this home. She has no idea where Derawello is. No one does. And so they set off on this journey, and they can't even find the place. They don't arrive until midnight because they get lost. They're asking townspeople, and no one knows where this town is. And they finally get there, and it's late at night, and they look at the place, and they realize they can't stay the night there because it's dirty and infested with vermin.
Yeah.
So that's just the beginnings of the Discalced Friars right there.
But so a few months later, John comes to Derawello. He precedes Fray Antonio by a few weeks, maybe, right? But when Saint Teresa returns to the foundation, she finds it in a little bit better state than when she left it.
Yeah, they did a lot of work on it over that time. And it's interesting that when Teresa first saw it, she was just like rejoicing and was overjoyed in this rundown, dilapidated place. But her companions who traveled with her were not nearly as excited as she was about it.
So the beginning of John entering the Reform, he goes to meet Teresa in Valladolid, where she's living, and he actually lives with the community of nuns there, and that's sort of his second period of novitiate and his introduction into the Reformed Discalced life.
Well, yeah, I think it's fascinating too that Teresa kind of took him on. You know, she was like the novice mistress in a sense to show him this is how we live. You know, and he had it was very providential because they hadn't quite entered cloister yet, and so he had the freedom to kind of be recreation, hear from her directly, you know, and just be taught like what is the Discalced way that she had, that God had done through her to bring about this reform. So he's just kind of sitting at the master's feet, receiving, you know, what Teresa is giving.
Sitting at the master's feet, but they both have strong wills in this regard, and maybe John has some ideas as well that he wants to bring to the table as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting that then Teresa would recall later about they allude to the fact that they didn't always agree about everything, which is just fascinating, I think, for us to think about is, but these two very strong-willed people, they both probably had their visions, and just to see how even the saints, they can clash heads at times in a loving way, but have real disagreements about what they envision for their life.
Yes. Well, and it helps emphasize too, though, like just how much, again, that Teresa, we call her our Holy Mother, but how amazing it is what she was able to do at that time period too, for a woman, a nun, to be able to get permission to bring this reform to the friars, the Carmelite friars, and then find herself finding the first friars.
And the location.
Obtaining all the needed permissions. And then, as we know too, instructing those first friars in the life. So we just really can see how that charism flowed through her into John, you know, who of course we call our Holy Father as well, but you just see how it was flowing through Teresa.
And connected to that, I think it's amazing that Teresa, it's not known for sure, but it seems like Teresa herself adapted the constitutions of the nuns for the friars, which would make sense. Like she was really the one who was leading this endeavor, so it makes sense that she would provide kind of this legislation and give it to the friars for them. This is how you are to live. But it's incredible at that time. Even today it would be, but at that time, there was a woman who was writing the legal legislation for a men's order.
Yes.
And just like totally, incredible.
Yeah.
And we know too that she designed the friar's habit that we still use the same design for today. She would have given it to Fray Juan in Medina del Campo before they left together to go to Valladolid. But it's interesting that he waited to put it on. And this sort of creates the first sort of point of communal life, consternation within communal life for Fray Antonio and Fray Juan.
Yes.
So maybe we can jump to back in Derawello at this point.
Yeah, because John arrives early. He actually goes with a stonemason, and then perhaps even with his brother, Francisco might have gone with them around this time too, to help like set everything up, to fix up the house. So they're working on this. And John's, I think, original plan was to wait until, because Antonio was going to come a little bit later, and like to wait till the real foundation to put on the habit. But once he arrives, he hears word of, there's rumors going around the town already. People are talking about the fact that these Discalced are coming, and so he wants to make a good impression. So he goes ahead before Antonio gets there, and he puts on the Discalced habit. And that's something that Antonio would never really forgive him for, because Antonio, in his mind, he was the first friar. He was the first one that he talked to Teresa, and but then John was the one who first put on the habit before
and lived the life in a sense
before
too.
Antonio arrived.
Yeah,
you can only imagine Antonio pulling up in
on his mule
to Derawello and seeing Fray Juan in the habit and just being dejected and disappointed in that regard. So they begin the foundation together on November 30th of 1568. So like I said, about over 450 years ago, and Holy Mother Saint Teresa comes to visit them later that spring. So November to sometime in the spring, she comes to check on them, right? And she's just so impressed and so joy-filled at seeing what she sees and seeing the way in which they're living the life with such with such poverty.
Yeah. Yeah, and she writes about that in her Foundations. I think it's like, I won't read the whole passage because it's rather long, but she just recounts that first visit to Derawello and just how pleased she was. And it really gives us a glimpse into the life that they were living. I never forget a little cross made for the holy water fount from sticks with a paper image of Christ attached to it. It inspired more devotion than if it had been something very expertly carved. The choir was in the loft. In the middle of the loft, the ceiling was high enough to allow for the recitation of the hours, but one had to stoop low in order to enter and to hear Mass. There were in the two corners facing the church 2 little hermitages, where one could do no more than either lie down or sit. Both were filled with hay because the place was very cold, and the roof almost touched one's head. Each had a little window facing the altar and a stone for a pillow, and there, too, the crosses and skulls. I learned that after the friars finished matins, they did not leave the choir before prime, but remained there in prayer, for their prayer was so deep that when it came time to say prime, their habits were covered with snow without their having become aware of the fact.
What I love about this period too is, her first impressions of everything and the vivid memory she has of first encountering these things. She's not writing this directly after the experience, so she's writing several years later, but still the great imprint that this memory had, that she was able to describe it with such vivid detail.
Well, I think it shows too, like, just how necessary it is to have this strong spirit at the beginning of something like this whole movement that 500 years later, more or less 450, here we are today wearing the same habit, trying to live the same life that was in seed form in Derawello, and but just how necessary those foundations were, so that something could grow from that, and how powerful that grace had to be.
Yeah, and Teresa goes on. She even talks about the kind of the ministry that they did in the surrounding towns, how they would go out, because this small town was basically it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so they'd leave in the morning. They would go out and preach at the surrounding towns where there weren't priests to provide that kind of catechesis, and then come back to the monastery in the afternoon or evening. So she was very impressed with the life that she encountered there, which she would maybe change her mind a little bit later. But she was very happy at this time.
Yes.
Well, I love the little vignette that she mentions Fray Antonio. We get a little sense of his scatterbrainedness, or sort of his personality, because he shows up with so little but happens to bring 5 clocks to this tiny little shack. But they wanted to keep an horarium very strictly, or at least Fray Antonio wanted to do this very strictly, so he thought that he needed this many clocks in Derawello.
They don't have pillows or mattresses, but they have 5 clocks.
Yeah, so it's interesting too that Derawello, it doesn't last for the entire period. They move on pretty quickly to other foundations, but they outgrow the facility very quickly. This small little tiny bedroom, only 2 hermitages, or this with only two places for 2 friars, really.
Yeah. It was only about a year and a half, I think, before they moved. The place where in Derawello was not the best house, and also not the best area, as far as I think it was known for being like rather damp and kind of moist and just not healthy. So they were actually offered, people in that area were obviously impressed with them, because they were offered a church, and they built a monastery beside the church. So they were offered something much as they were growing to grow into.
Well, if I could just say too, just how the people accepted them. There's so many religious at that time, and people knew religious. There were monasteries everywhere, different groups, and even different reforms. But something about these Discalced Friars was very striking to people, and they were like, wow, this is something different, and I think it just shows to how John's spirit and what God was doing in him, and those ideals he was able to carry into the life, and kind of make that kind of impact with their prayer, deep prayer hours, the 2 hours that we still do today. They had that there, but then their own time of prayer after that, of the silent prayer, having their apostolate too. So it was very eremitical, but at the same time, very evangelical. But just there was something new that really struck people's imagination, and then started bringing people to want to join.
There's a famous story when Teresa comes to visit them. about their footwear that I think is we can't skip that. It's a great vignette. Does one of you want to share that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. That she was a little bit nervous by some of the austerity that she saw. You know, she thought that this might push them in a direction that would maybe scare people off who could be very good Discalced Carmelite Friars. And one of the things was that they walked in barefoot, and it was, you know, in the winter, like you said, it's cold there. The winters are stronger even in that part of Castile. And so she made them promise, you know, that you have to wear sandals. You can't go around barefoot.
Yeah, and we even see that put into their early constitutions that basically that the idea was that they were supposed to go barefoot except in the cold. Mm-hmm. And it's like that was listed because Teresa's insistence.
Yeah.
Like she didn't want her friars dying.
Yes.
She knew they needed to take care of themselves in order to carry out this mission given to them by God.
And she seemed to have no problem with the moldy bread for dinner and boiled cabbage and acorns for feast days.
Feast days, yeah. That's
yeah. We see the poverty that they would have suffered from at times, and then also other times when they were really blessed by the generosity of people around them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we know that they eventually make their way to Pastrana, where John serves as a novice master for a time, and then to Alcala, not too very long after that, where they begin a student house. So you can already see the growth in the amount of men coming to join the Reform, for the need to have these stages of formation along the way to bring more and more men into the Reform.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. Like that was one thing that strikes me sometimes reading back over this stuff is how quickly it grew.
Yeah.
Because it went very quickly from just being these two friars to like having several monasteries within a short period of time. And John went from being at the very center of it all to being, I mean, he was a student master, he was a novice master for a time, but it just grew beyond him.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly.
And you can see where his gifts lied too in that. Like he was formator, you know, he was kind of the spiritual heart of the Reform, as opposed to maybe, you know, always being in charge or making, you know, administrative decisions. He definitely, I think, was much more at home as a formator.
That's actually a good point, because I've noticed this later on in John's life. Teresa herself at one point recommended who she thought should be elected provincial later on of the Discalced, and she doesn't recommend John of the Cross. And it's very interesting because she highly respects John, but you can see how God gives us all different gifts. It's like, I mean, St. Paul says, right? He talks about some people have gifts of administration and others don't, and it doesn't mean you're not a good holy person or a saint if you don't have a certain gift. But we all have these different gifts, and it seems like John had like a great gift for like reading souls and directing people and forming people, but perhaps he just didn't have as much like that gift for administration.
Yeah.
So we know that around this time, Teresa receives a very difficult position. She's sent back to the Incarnation, the monastery where she began her life as a nun and eventually ultimately left in order to start the Reform. She's sent back there to be the prioress. And it says a lot about her love for Fray Juan, because she wants him by her side and helping her with this tall difficulty that she's going to encounter.
Well, you think, of the amount of nuns, the way the lifestyle is very different there, where she originally was. You know, she goes back to where she originally
150.
was. 150 versus 13 that she was prior of at San Jose. So, yeah, just what that's going to take in terms of like the spiritual improvement she wishes to bring there. It's going to take someone very special. And so she knew, who to go for.
And this is such a big task for her, because she didn't want this.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the nuns in Avila, at the Incarnation, they didn't want her. They didn't choose her. It was the leaders of in the order that told Teresa basically to go back to the Incarnation. Yeah. So imagine how hard it would be to go back to this place. People who kind of saw you as a traitor, almost leaving the monastery, and now you're put in charge of them. Yeah. But you see in both John and Teresa, when they're there together, they're like the way that they slowly win over the hearts of those nuns to bring about like a fruitful conversion.
Yeah.
And with great difficulty comes great graces for both Saint Teresa and Saint John. In this time, this period together, we know that that Holy Mother Saint Teresa sort of comes to the experience of spiritual marriage while she's prioress of the Incarnation. We know that during this time that Fray Juan, St. John of the Cross, he experiences a vision of Christ on the cross that has become very famous. It appears here on the cover of our edition of the collected works of St. John of the Cross, and is adapted by artists throughout the generations, including Salvador Dali, his famous painting of the Crucifixion. So these graces occur during this period at the Incarnation, and I think that kind of goes to show the great gifts that God gives to us, especially to his beloved, that he wants to share with them in the midst of great difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is it's something very helpful to remember too, because we can often be in a position where maybe we don't have as much quiet or solitude, like probably both of them would have enjoyed, being in that assignment. But that's where the greatest graces did happen. And so in unfavorable circumstances, we can still be confident. Like that's where we're brought to sometimes new levels that we could never foresee.
We also see the beauty of holy relationships and how John and Teresa were really like building each other up during this time. They were there in Avila together for 5 years, but it's estimated that Teresa was probably away for about 3 of those years, traveling, forming new foundations of new monasteries. So, but this is the only time in their life that they had regular like personal contact and would have like lived close by and spoken often. So you can imagine like just the great. We can only speculate, unfortunately, but the great impact it would have on both of their lives.
Well, we know also through a conversation they were having about the Trinity that both of them go into ecstasy
Right.
in that moment. There's one sort of postcard of picture of what some of their conversations ultimately led to building them both up in regard to love for God and experiencing these great graces.
Yeah, I think there was someone walked into the parlor and they're both kind of levitating off their chairs. At least that's the tradition, that's portrayed in paint. But that you can see, I think, too, later on in their writings. Teresa in Interior Castle, there's certain aspects where she says, I learned this, and I didn't know this before, but someone helped me see this. And there's a lot of speculation that was John, and that was during their time where she was able to kind of get some things straight in terms of the interior faculties and kind of the way the Spirit moves in those ways. And then with John as well, when he talks about the grace of the foundress, the flaming dart and the living flame of love, where so much of that was through his experience of talking to Holy Mother, and so many of his experiences that he would write about later quite possibly came from her,
And it's during this time where he gains a real clinical sort of understanding of the supernatural life, both as his role as a confessor for the nuns at the Incarnation, but also as an exorcist in the area. And we have various accounts of ways in which he was able to help people who were suffering a great deal at the devil's hands. Mm-hmm. So during the time that John was living at the Incarnation, he actually wasn't living in the Incarnation. He was living with the Discalced Friars in Avila and was commuting, you could say, to the Incarnation to work with the nuns. But something happens where this becomes no longer tenable, and he actually moves to a chaplain's quarters within the grounds of the Incarnation, La Torrecilla. And John, in this period, we begin to see some of the tensions mounting between himself and the other Discalced Carmelite Friars.
Yeah, I would imagine even at the beginning when John moved there, he wasn't on great terms with some of these friars because, again, he left in order to form this reformed house. But I think at first he lived with them and it was probably okay. But as I think he won over the hearts of the nuns at the Incarnation, originally the nuns at the Incarnation, they didn't really want anything to do with John or Teresa so much. But there's a great story of John hearing the confession of a nun, and she only wants to confess to one of the Discalced friars, and so she asks, "Are you Discalced?" And they're in the confessional, so they can't see each other, and so John, he just takes his scapular, his habit, and puts it over his feet and says, "Yes, I'm Discalced." And then he hears her confession. But slowly John begins to build these relationships of trust, and he becomes really sought after by the nuns. And I think as that happens, the Calced friars become a little more jealous because suddenly they're not desired anymore by the nuns. It's John that's desired. And so that, along with so many other complicated issues that are happening throughout the order, just cause this tension, like you said. Yeah. And eventually John has to move out of that monastery. He can't live there anymore. Mm-hmm. So it's great. Teresa builds this, provides this quarters for him and another friar to live on the property, actually, of the Incarnation. So it's just beautiful that they were living in such close quarters during that time.
Well, and it's neat too because it opened him up too to be able to do some other ministry, and I think it's a good thing to keep in mind that even though he was always going for the contemplative life and very devoted to prayer and silence still, but he of course was sharing confessions now and doing a lot of spiritual direction. But he even saw some kind of some youth in the neighborhood that he started catechizing, and they became very devoted to him, and so he had an impact on the lay people too around him. So it wasn't like he just kind of stayed in his cell all the time. He discerned how he was able to live that contemplative life but still be very open to the needs that he kind of saw around him.
So ultimately these tensions grow and grow to the point where we'll discuss in a future episode where he's ultimately arrested and kept in confinement in Toledo. But it's a very complicated and nuanced sort of series and sequence of events that happens. But maybe just to give a short little snippet of how everything sort of came to a culmination.
Yeah, it seems like there was a lot of confusion over who was the lawful authority in all of this. And so there seemed to be there's one group under a nuncio or visitator that was placed under the Pope, and then there was also the general of the order, and both thought that they had the rightful authority. And so there was just a lot of tension involved in this and a lot of confusion. So John thought he was being obedient to his superiors, who he was supposed to, but also the Calced friars at that time saw John and Teresa as being kind of disobedient to their authority. Mm. And so it was all very confused. And so even before the famous imprisonment of John, he's put in prison one time, and right away the nuncio intervenes and makes the friars release him. But you can just see all of this just it's like a boiling kettle. It's getting so tense.
Well, they even had to put guards up in front of the little house. Yes. Some of the lay people in the town that started keeping watch because they were afraid that he might get sequestered.
Right.
So we'll leave it at that cliffhanger, right?
The boiling kettle.
The boiling kettle, and will it overflow, and all of these things for next time. But I think that really paints a great picture of what was going on and what ultimately led to this extremely influential moment in John's life, his imprisonment, which we'll talk about, I believe, next time. If you want to untangle the webs of all of the turmoil that was growing and what led to this bubbling kettle, I recommend a recent release through ICS Publications, In Context, written by Father Mark O'Keefe, OSB. It's a great kind of untangles a lot of the webs and gives a real clear picture of what was going on and all the nuance involved. So if you've always wondered how the tensions mounted, it's a great resource to turn to. And for other things regarding what was going on in Spain at this time when the reform was occurring. Great. So we thank you for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week here on CarmelCast. Thank you and God bless. Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.